So continuing on with our outstanding guest speaker series, today the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to present Mr. Jonathan Fairchild. Jonathan is the historian at the Homestead National Monument of America, a unit of the National Park Service in Nebraska. He's dedicated to telling the story of the American homesteader. He has been in the position since February 2019 and has been with the National Park Service since 2017, previously serving as an archives technician at the, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Keweenaw National Historical Park. Born and raised in Texas, he received a bachelor's degree in American history from the University of Texas at San Antonio, his master's degree in American history at the University of Houston, and is currently a doctoral candidate in American history at the University of Houston. His dissertation, titled They Intend to Conduct Us Out of Their Country, the Choctaw Dysphoria, studies Native American history from the 18th century through the present in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. Jonathan's most recent project is on the link between homesteading and suffrage. He argues that women homesteaders were integral to the passage of the 19th Amendment, securing the vote for American women, which will be celebrating its centennial in 2020. He has led numerous discussions at Homestead National Monument of America, as well as with community partners. At the monument, he oversees National Historic Preservation Act compliance, assists scholars and visitors with research and record requests, maintains the monument's research library, conducts original research to further the field of homesteading history, and helps park staff interpret the Homestead Act of 1862 and the impact it has had on the United States history. So without further ado, I would like to offer a warm virtual welcome to potentially soon, Dr. Jonathan Fairchild. And Jonathan, the helm is now turned over to you. Are you there?
Yes, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and hopefully, fingers crossed, soon to be Dr. Fairchild. Not quite there just yet. But yeah, very excited to present for y'all today. I have a couple of things that I'd love to share with you about genealogy, about conducting research with homesteading records and land records. Of course, the main focus of today's presentation is talking about women's suffrage and the centennial, which is actually just around the corner, coming up in August. So before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about the Homestead Act and what we do here at Homestead National Monument of America. So of course, we are dedicated to telling the story of the Homestead Act, to telling the story of homesteading, which actually began right here where the monument is located in 1862. It was signed into law by President Lincoln May 20th, 1862, took effect January 1st, 1863, a very busy year for the Lincoln administration. Just one of several very important laws. Yeah, the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Pacific Railways Act, the Homestead Act, and of course the Emancipation Proclamation, all taking effect in January 1863. So I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the park here. So the Homestead Act was a revolutionarily democratic piece of legislation. It allowed men, women, African Americans, immigrants, essentially anyone who could become a United States citizen to claim free land. You could claim 160 acres of free land, which I think in many ways was emblematic of the American dream, of this opportunity that was provided under the Homestead Act. So you see here on the map, and let me pull out a laser pointer, this spot right here was actually the very first claim made under the Homestead Act. That was Daniel Freeman, and he met a land office agent when he signed his paperwork just after midnight on January 1st, 1863. He was actually at a New Year's Eve party, ran into the land office agent there and convinced him to open up the office, sign the paperwork so he could go ahead and file it literally as soon as that law took effect. So he was the very first homesteader, and as I said, Homestead National Monument is located right on his 160-acre claim. But we talk about the whole story of the Homestead Act. We talk about all of the many states across the country where the Homestead Act was in place, and we talk about the story from the very beginning in the 1860s, to the very end when it was repealed in the 1980s. A lot of people, when they think homesteading, they think Little House on the Prairie, they think covered wagons, but it goes well into American history, just being repealed barely 35, 40 years ago. So if you look at this map behind me here, any of the states you see in brown, from Florida in the southeast here, all the way through the Great Plains into the west and Alaska, all of these 30 states in the brown were eligible to claim land under the Homestead Act of 1862. A few of them were largely settled prior to the passage of the law. So you have the states over here, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. You could technically claim land under the Homestead Act, but mostly the public lands or federal lands available in these states were claimed prior to 1862. But we do talk about the story of the 270 million acres across the entire country claimed under that law, and it's estimated that approximately 93 million living descendants of homesteaders today. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a bit here about how you can access some of the records of homesteading. So there were a few requirements to claim land under the Homestead Act. So I mentioned earlier it was passed in the middle of the Civil War, passed in 1862, took effect 1863. One of the requirements was that, at least initially, you couldn't have taken up arms against the United States. So if you had fought for the Confederacy, for the first 10 years or so, you couldn't actually claim a homestead. You had to be 21 or the head of a household. You had to settle on your parcel of land for 5 years. And you had to be on that land for at least 6 months out of every year. So you could leave for a few months, but you had to be there for planting and harvesting because there were agricultural requirements to the law. You had to cultivate crops or raise livestock, and then you had to build a house, a residence on your homestead. And after you finished all of those requirements, you received the deed or the patent to your land. And that's actually one of the resources I'm going to be talking about. So the paperwork that you go to the land office to fill out each step showing that you were meeting these requirements, that's actually all still kept by the federal government. And some of it's available digitally, some unfortunately just in the National Archives. But I'm going to talk about how you can access either what's available digitally or in the archives and some of the tools available for that. So you see a picture here of Homestead National Monument of America. This is our Heritage Center. It's our main park museum and exhibit area. This is actually a relatively new building in the National Park Service. This building you see here was built in 2007. The park itself dates back to 1936. And you might be able to see, and I'll highlight it with the mouse here, these right here, this is what we call the living wall. And the living wall displays all 30 homesteading states with a cutout in the center of each state representing the percentage of land area claimed by homesteaders. So here in Nebraska, we were the most heavily claimed homesteading state at just under half the total land area of Nebraska, about 22 million acres and over 100,000 homesteads claimed. So I figured I'd put a question to the chat. Unfortunately, I can't see the responses, so if Sue could jump in, but I have a question. If Nebraska was about half the state, 22 million acres, 100,000 homesteaders, how much homesteading land do you think was claimed in Nevada? I'll give a second for the guesses to come in here.
Okay, I'm just waiting for the class to send some responses here. I'm going to type in my guess. They're saying less than 10%. I'm going to say 75%.
So in Nevada, it's actually about 1% of the total state area is claimed by homesteaders. Around 700,000 acres and 4,000 successful homesteads. So because agriculture was a key part of the law, that you had to farm successfully for 5 years, you might be able to guess that Nevada is not known for its bountiful agricultural growing seasons, right? So much of the state too hot and too dry to really be able to farm easily. So Nevada actually had very little land claimed under the Homestead Act, but quite a few states across the West and the Midwest, upwards of 20, 30, 40% even of the state would be claimed for the Homestead Act. And one of the major themes we talk about here is how the Homestead Act empowered groups that were traditionally marginalized. I mentioned before that women were welcome to homestead. You had to be the head of the household, which meant for women at that point in American history, you had to be either a single woman or a widowed woman, but they were welcome to claim land. African Americans could homestead. And so all these groups, immigrants coming in the mid-1800s, early 1900s, could homestead. All these groups said, historically in America, didn't have quite the same access to land ownership and property. Claiming large amounts of land. Sometimes by the end, even 1,000+ acres of land with all the various public land laws available. So I see that as, like I said, part of the American dream of being able to claim land and have all these opportunities. And of course, we do talk about here at the monument that the Homestead Act, though it was a wonderful opportunity for millions of people, wasn't a wonderful opportunity for everyone, right? We do talk about the impact to Native Americans across the country, and unfortunately, some of the legacies of dispossession tied to that. And certainly acknowledge that aspect of the history as well. So just for a little bit of background context on public land laws, I'll scoot out of the way here so you can see the image. I wanted to talk a bit about the Land Ordinance of 1785. So basically right after the birth of the United States of America, the government's trying to think about how to distribute, how to survey, how to map out all this land in the country. And the Land Ordinance of 1785 implements what's called the Public Land Survey System, a square grid-based survey system that ends up being used by the Homestead Act and a bunch of other public land laws to map out all the land in the country, to sell it, to distribute it under the Homestead Act. And so you might be able to see this image right here. It says 640 acres. So 640 acres is a section of land. In a section of land, there would be 4 equal smaller squares here. A quarter section would be what a homestead was. So initially, you had to purchase a whole section in the late 1700s for $1 per acre. So the thought today of 640 acres of land for $640 sounds fantastic, but back then that was actually a lot of money. And not very many people could afford $640 at a time. It ended up being a lot of land speculators that would purchase it. So throughout the early 1800s, the government is trying to figure out, well, how do we make land more available? How do we get it into the hands of actual farmers to benefit as many Americans as possible? And so the Homestead Act ends up doing 160 acres, and it does it almost for free. The land itself was free. There were a few filing fees that you'd have to pay. Whoops. So you can see here all of the lands under the public survey system and in public lands across the nation. So right over here, you see all this in white. That would be the original 13 states and states carved out of those 13 states. So Kentucky and Tennessee, Maine, Vermont. But most of the country, with the exception of Texas, which is a unique situation because of the status of its being a country in the 1830s, 1840s, and when it was annexed by the United States, the treaties it signed. But most of the rest of the country, so basically from here on west, that is all originally federal public lands. And so it's all surveyed, mapped out for potential distribution whether it's by sale, giving away to veterans, homesteading land, Desert Land Act, all sorts of things. So you'll see here a couple of things I want to point out. I mentioned a township. So a township right here has 36 sections in it. And probably a little small on your screen, but it goes from 1 through 6, 7 through 12, 13 through 18, back and forth, back and forth. So each one of those small numbers, that's 640 acres. And so this is a section blown up here. So a quarter section, that's the size of one homestead. So you could have 4 homesteads potentially in one section. And again, 36 sections in a township. So I mentioned the genealogical resources and records available. One second, I'm going to pop off air so you can see that without the, there we go. So the Homestead Records Project, over the course of the 120-year history of the Homestead Act, there are millions and millions of pages of federal documents as land offices would record each distribution of a homestead. So if you look here on the map, all of those states in green have all of that documentation recorded by the General Land Office, recorded and digitized online. And that's actually available with a partnership we've been working on with Ancestry. Now, those records do exist for all 30 states. So if you have ancestors in one of the states in the white there, those case files do still exist. They're just located in the National Archives in D.C. It's a total of 30 million pages of information. So we're working on this project to digitize eventually all of these states in the white here. But anything there in the green is already online digitized. And I'm going to share a little bit about what you can find in those records, because they're these fantastic treasure troves of historical and genealogical information, anything at all ranging from when your ancestor may have settled on the land. If they were immigrants, you'll have naturalization records, you'll have citizenship papers. If there were any sort of legal disputes, you'll see that. If there are military records, often you'll see that. So this wide variety of documentation all condensed into one neat little packet for you, which I think is just a fantastic tool, and doubly so that so many of them can be found online on Ancestry. So what all is in these records? You can see here, every single one follows roughly the same formula. You'll always have an application for a homestead. You'll have the receipts. Like I said, the land itself was free. There were small filing fees. Basically, the costs go to the land office and take care of the paperwork. Generally about $15, $18 per homestead, which even in the 1860s for 160 acres of land was a bargain. The minimum cost to buy an acre of land back then was $1.25. So instead of being $200 to buy that land outright, you're talking less than 10% of that cost. Like I said, naturalization paperwork. So immigrants were welcome to homestead. You had to declare your intent to become a citizen before claiming the land. But as long as you became a citizen by the end of that 5-year period, you could claim and prove up your homestead. Like I said, military documentation. Some of the richest documentation is the witness and homesteader testimony or affidavits. So that would be a series of questions, usually in a questionnaire format, which tells sometimes the size of the house, tells the crops planted, a wide variety of information, whether they left the homestead sometimes to pursue an education or work in town, things of that nature. So all sorts of stuff. And I'm actually going to walk us through some of the examples here. So here you see the initial application. The very first step of homesteading would be simply to go to the land office, declare your intent to claim a homestead. You'd pick out your parcel of land and then pay your application fee, and that would be recorded here. So this will have your basics, your name of the homesteader, the date that you were claiming it, the legal land description, which I'll talk about a little bit more here, but section, township, and range. It would mention whether you were a U.S. citizen or an immigrant at that point. Then you'll have the receipts from your visit to the land office where you were filing your claim. So those receipts are always located in this case file. Like I said, about $18 for 160 acres of land. And homesteaders had an option after a year of being on the land, if you decided that either you didn't want to wait the 5 years to prove up your homestead, or perhaps you thought it would be more beneficial to purchase it outright, you could do what was called commuting a claim. And basically you would buy out your remaining 4 years for that minimum $1.25 per acre. So sometimes you'll see a homestead claimed, but it's listed in the records as being a cash sale, and that's what's usually going on with that. Another requirement to make your final proof was posting a notice in the local newspaper. Here you see a notice in the newspaper there. So this served the purpose of fighting potential fraud. Neighbors of homesteaders would be able to see this in the local newspaper for the 6, 7, 8 weeks it ran and say, wait a second, John hasn't actually been on that land for 5 years, or John's been gone for more than 6 months out of every year. He's not meeting those requirements. So I mentioned that immigrants were welcome to claim, but you did have to include your naturalization and your citizenship paperwork in there. And it's actually very intentional that the framework of the Homestead Act was done the way it was. So that 5-year period to prove up land was actually the same required of immigrants under naturalization laws at the time. You had to declare your intent, you had to have residency. So some of the same things going on with the Homestead Act and with becoming a citizen. So in many ways, the Homestead Act not only is created to give away land, but also to populate that land with people coming from all over the world. And for a lot of, especially with European immigrants in the late 1800s, a family farm at that point in much of Europe might be 30, 40 acres of land, and then would be given usually to the firstborn son. And so for many of the kids, having your own farm is just not in the question. And even if you have a farm, it's going to be pretty small. So to get 160 acres of your own farmland in the United States, that would have been huge for a lot of immigrants. And people came from all across the world to take advantage of the Homestead Act.
Jonathan, I'm going to jump in just for a moment. If I could please have our student who signed in under the name of Safran, if you could please turn off your camera because your name is showing on our screen. If you turn off your camera, and you can do that by just going to the top of your screen, and there should be a little icon with a camera. And if you could just please click on it, and there should be a line drawn through it, and that'll take your name off of our screen. I'll turn the helm back over to you, Jonathan. I'm sorry for that interruption.
No problem. So here you see an example of some of the rich documentation you can find in these land entry case files. We see the naturalization paperwork for Joseph Richterich, who was a Czech homesteader not far from the monument here in Wilbur, Nebraska. It may be hard to read all that text, but it says that he testified that he was born in Bohemia in Europe in 1836, immigrated to the United States, and arrived at the port of New York in September of 1857, that he renounced his allegiance to the Emperor of Austria to become a citizen of the U.S. in Manitowoc, Wisconsin in 1860. So I think this is just a really cool document that you can find in a homestead claim, something entirely unrelated to the citizenship process, but here it is. It's available. It's online, digitized, and that it shows multiple steps of that process all at once. So I think it's a really cool opportunity to be able to have these online. So there you see a copy of an actual citizenship certificate there, and any naturalized citizen will have that as well as the naturalization paperwork. Sometimes I've seen some that aren't as fancy and official as this. They'll literally be hand-drawn with like a little squiggly seal drawn by the county clerk or a notary, something like that. But you will see these quite often. So, like I said, the witness and the homesteader testimony, these are one of my favorite aspects. These are just absolutely rich, fantastic documents. So on the right, we see here Joseph Graff and Samuel Kilpatrick. These are actually the witnesses for the homestead that we're on here at Homestead National Monument. These are Daniel Freeman's witnesses, the first homesteaders' witnesses. They say that he built a stable, that he built a sheep shed, 100-foot-long corn crib, 40 apple trees, 400 peach trees, built a log cabin that was 14 by 20 feet with 1 story, 2 doors, 2 windows, a shingle roof and board floors, and that is, quote, a comfortable house to live in. You see that he was married and had 2 children. So I just think that that level of detail, a lot of the time, you're literally not going to find that kind of detail anywhere else. So on the left here, we have another from Václav Novak, a Czech homesteader not too far in Saunders County, Nebraska. Have his witness testimony that he's become a citizen, that he has settled and established a sod house, that he broke and planted the land and valued it at $600. And of course, we have the actual homesteader's testimony, essentially the same information you see in the witness testimony, but these are, if you're looking at your ancestors, these are your ancestors' own words about what they were doing. So definitely awesome to see that. I'll often see their signature on it as well. Absolutely fantastic resources. So finally, we have in each case file the patent of the land, or the deed, basically. So this was the official transfer from federal land ownership to private land ownership. And for homesteaders, this was 5 years of their lives. This was their hopes, their dreams, what they'd been working so hard for. And believe me, it was hard work. So being able to see this, that's just amazing to me. The stories that go into homesteading for millions of people across the country, this is a success story here. So I want to talk a little bit more about how to actually access this. You'll see a couple of websites here. The top one, GLOW Records, so that's General Land Office Records.blm, Bureau of Land Management.gov. So that's a great place to start to find out, maybe you don't know if someone in your family tree homesteaded. That has all of the federal land records and transfers from when the General Land Office was established to the present. Any federal land at all, whether it's homesteading or sales, military land bounties, all sorts of stuff. So I'm going to take us through that so we can get a feel for what that looks like. All right, can everyone see the website there?
Yes, we can see it.
So we're going to go here to Search Documents. And you can actually do this with very little information. If all you have is a state and a last name, that's often enough. Sometimes if you're searching a common name like, Jones or Smith or Johnson, you might need a county or a first name, but you can at least try and see what you can find. If you need to cast a smaller net, you can always do that. So I'll go ahead and pull something up in Nevada. And I believe y'all are Washoe County, is that correct?
Yes, the majority of my class is Washoe.
Okay, so I'm going to pull up Washoe County, and then you see down here there are actually quite a few different things you can specify. I recommend at first trying just the basics, but since I'm specifically looking for a homesteader, I'm going to go down here to where it says authority. This is the legal authority or the law that a certain type of land was claimed under. You'll see quite a few here. You don't have to use this as a search, but since I want to find a homesteader, I'm going to go here. There are a few different homestead laws. I want Homestead Entry Original, May 20, 1862. So I click on that, and I'm not looking for anyone in particular, so I'll just hit search patents here. And I find that there are actually 23 pages of homesteaders just in this one county. So that's actually a pretty big chunk of all the homesteaders in the state, actually. But I'm going to go ahead and pick one. A couple of things you see on the index here. So you see the date. This is when the patent was filed. Hang on, I'm going to try and make it a little less grainy there. Is that better? So we have the date it was filed, state, the Meridian. So this isn't necessarily where the homestead was, just the closest place that the survey went out from. I talked earlier about sections, township, and range. That's what's known as the legal land description. And so that's always done as 3 numbers. It goes section, township, range. And if you have just those numbers, you can always find where your parcel of land is. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this one here. So we see, of course, homestead entry originally was a homesteader, claimed 80 acres of land. The land office was in Carson City, so there'd be a few different land offices across the state. Sometimes they could be fairly far away. We have this map tool. You can actually find out exactly where a homestead was just by clicking the button. Scroll down here. So the large orange square, that is the township. You'll see a smaller orange square within it. That is the section. So this is section 18 of township 19 north, range, what does that say, 20 east. And we are looking at the east half of the northwest quarter. So you may have heard me say that there are 640 acres in a section. This is 1 mile by 1 mile, 640 acres. So this is an 80-acre parcel. Normally homesteads would be 160. So you divide this into 4, and you'd have 1 homestead, 1 homestead, 1 homestead, 1 homestead. A total of 4 in a 640-acre section. This one's only 80. There are a couple of reasons that could be the case. Most frequently would be that if you're located near railroad land, you could only get 80 acres rather than the full 160 because that was considered to be more valuable land. So we see that we're looking at the east half of the northwest quarter. So this right here would be the northwest quarter. So the east half of that would basically be right about here. So we can figure out exactly where that homestead is. You can also, with this tool, see the patent image. So this is a copy of the actual patent that a homesteader would have received after their 5 years of proving up a parcel of land. Get a second to load here. And this resource here, the General Land Office Records, this is a free public access resource. There's no login, no monthly fee, nothing like that. You can just go to that website you see at the top of the screen and search anywhere in the country. While it's loading, I may just show you the other resource I wanted to talk about. So I mentioned that certain states are available on Ancestry. So many of you will probably recognize this as literally just Ancestry.com. And say we want to look up a homesteader in the county. So I already have it set, and if you want to look up specifically homestead records, you'll go to the card catalog and type in the word homestead. It'll be the 3rd one down when you search that way. And you can search just homestead records and search. And this pulls up, I'll just click this first one here. This pulls up those documents that I showed you in the PowerPoint, the land entry case files. And so you can scroll through and see your ancestors' specific information. They're usually about 15, 20 pages, sometimes even 30, 40. I've actually found one that was literally hundreds of pages. It was very unique. There was a murder on the homestead, and the widow of the murdered homestead claimant was trying to receive the land. So sometimes you'll find some very, very interesting and unique stories all documented in these. But once again, we have 10 of the 30 states fully digitized, so you can pull these up on Ancestry. And these documents do still exist for all of the states. Some of them are just only available at the National Archives. And I'd be happy to take questions once I'm done at the end of the presentation, talk a little bit more about this. But I wanted to also talk about, now that we know some of the basics of homesteading, wanted to talk about a project I've been working on recently. So now that you know the basics of the Homestead Act, we can get down to business. I want to pose another question to the group here, so get ready to type out in the chat. When you think about famous people from American history, what are some of the first names that come to mind? Anyone at all in American history? Who do you think of?
Okay, I'm waiting for the class to respond in the chat box. Let's see here. The first person I would think of, when I think of history, I mean, obviously for land grants would be Abraham Lincoln. But I'm waiting for the class to kind of pipe in. George Washington, someone says. Vanderbilt.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm noticing a common thread here. A lot of presidents being named, and that's certainly common every time I do this exercise. There's a lot of presidents, and all the names you mentioned are men, and specifically white men. And that's almost always the response I get with this exercise. And here at Homestead National Monument and throughout the National Park Service, we think it's very important to talk about the history of all Americans, right? To talk about the entirety of the American experience. And so often, unfortunately, the history of women, the history of Black, Indigenous, and people of color hasn't been as fully told as perhaps it might be. And so this year, of course, like I said earlier, we're celebrating the centennial of the women's suffrage movement. So we're really researching and talking about the role of women homesteaders in the suffrage movement. So in the mid-1800s, right around the time the Homestead Act was passed, American women actually possessed few legal rights until 1848 with the Married Women's Property Act. When American women got married, they literally lost the ownership of any property they may have had, and that would all transfer to the husband. And of course, at this point in American history, they don't have the vote. And when they were homesteading, married women, we just saw those records, right? We just saw the land entry case files and the general land office records. So married women couldn't homestead, and when they're reflected in those papers, sometimes they're literally just recorded as, written as wife and then 2 children or whatever the case may be. But homesteading was a very, very difficult task. 5 years of building a house on the Great Plains out of literally the sod, the earth, and trying to cut through that sod and farm and make something out of nothing. That was difficult for anyone to do alone. And so homesteading women were very, very important for the work at hand. There was a daughter of a homesteader out here in Nebraska, Marie Sandoz, an author, who said of a wife on a homestead, "Nothing happened after she arrived that did not vitally touch her. Particularly important was her place in accident or in sickness, with doctors so few and far between. And when drought and hail and wind came, it was the housewife who set as good a table as possible from what remained and sustained the morale of her family." Now, that being said, women, of course, weren't just homesteading behind the scenes as spouses and as partners. So if you look at the picture behind me here, you'll see a group of 4 homesteading women. These are the Chrisman sisters. They homesteaded here in Nebraska in the western part of the state, an area called the Sand Hills. This 1886 image shows Hattie, Lizzie, Lucy, and Ruth Chrisman, who claimed land under the Homestead Act, under the Timber Culture Act. They bought land outright, and these sisters ended up acquiring hundreds of acres of land, each in their own names. So women homesteaders, many of them saw the Homestead Act from 1862 on as this wonderful opportunity to acquire property. The Homestead Act was gender neutral. It did allow women to claim land as long as they were single or widowed. And Western states especially saw this opportunity of gender neutrality to spur immigration, try and get people to come out to these brand new states, provide opportunity and access to land. And that, of course, had these social and political impacts, one of which was women's suffrage, which, of course, today we consider a foundation of democracy, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that process unfolds from 1862 through 1920. So many people know about some of the early moments in the women's suffrage movement. They know about Seneca Falls in 1848 and the Declaration of Sentiments. They know names like Susan B. Anthony. They know Wittenmeyer. They know Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But a lot of the focus on the history of the women's suffrage movement is on often New York, which, of course, was huge in the suffrage movement. Other urban centers, major urban centers, but usually the East Coast, not a lot on rural America and their contributions to the suffrage movement, which I found to be pretty important, pretty significant across the country. So the Homestead Act in 1862 is closely connected to the suffrage. If you look at this map here, you'll see what I mean. Almost all of the states that granted women full voting rights prior to the 19th Amendment, the sole exception being New York here, all of the rest of them gave away land under the Homestead Act. So the most heavily homesteaded states were often the earliest adopters of women's suffrage. Wyoming was the very first in 1869 when it was just a territory. But also other earlier states. You have Utah, you have Oregon and Washington and California, Idaho, Montana. 15 of the 16 homesteading states west of the Missouri River. So Missouri River is right here. And all of these states here, except for Texas, these are all homesteading states. And you'll notice I'm not sure if you can read the key, but so the dark blue here, these states here, had full voting rights before the 19th Amendment and before statehood. So they actually granted women's suffrage when they were just territories and kept it when they became states. Then you have the light blue, full voting rights before the 19th Amendment. The dark green is what's known as presidential suffrage. Women could at least vote in presidential elections. And then the states in the yellow, women gained voting rights after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So the only homesteading state west of the Missouri River to not grant at least presidential suffrage is New Mexico. Almost all the rest of them do. So the only non-homesteading state to grant full suffrage is New York. Michigan, you might think, well, wait a second, that's an eastern state, right? So Michigan actually was fairly heavily homesteaded, especially in the northern parts of the state and the upper peninsula. So Michigan, also a homesteading state. Then you have these 3 in green as presidential non-homesteading. So you have Maine, Rhode Island, Tennessee. Only 4 non-homesteading states grant women's suffrage prior to the 19th Amendment, and only 1 western homesteading state doesn't. So I think that's a pretty clear indicator of something going on with that. Now, there is also another special case. These states down here were what's referred to as the Southern Homestead Act. It's a closely related law following their readmission to the Union after the Civil War. So they're a little bit different than what's going on in the Western states, different social, cultural, and demographic trends going on in those states versus these. So for the majority of homesteading, you see that suffrage tie. We saw this map earlier. I just thought it'd be a great way to remind you. So once again, the brown are all homesteading states. You'll see two different colors of dates. So the year is the year that state provided suffrage. Some of these are a little off because like 1890, that's when it became a state. Actually granted suffrage in 1869 as a territory, but statehood 1890, 1896. So you see some of these in the West granting it as early as the 1890s, then quite a bit of the Midwest homesteading areas in the 1910s, and it is until right before the 19th Amendment is passed that you see any of the states over here in 1917, 1919. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about a specific example. Use our state of Nebraska here. So you'll see, once again, the key, a couple of colors here. Yellow voted yes in all elections. Red voted yes in 1914 and 1882. Blue voted yes in 1914, didn't exist in 1882. And green voted yes in 1914 only. And two more, purple voted yes in one early election, and gray never voted in favor. So here in Nebraska, we had 3 votes on women's suffrage in 1871, 1882, and 1914, before finally being passed in 1917. So early in Nebraska history, just after statehood, some of those leading national suffrage figures I mentioned, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, actually arrived in Nebraska to help campaign and develop a suffrage group for the Constitutional Convention in 1871, which could have potentially made Nebraska the very first state to grant women suffrage. But sadly, male voters resoundingly voted it down, with less than a quarter voting in favor. So if you look on the map here, the counties in yellow or in purple supported suffrage that early in Nebraska history. So it was placed on the ballot again in 1882, when Omaha hosted 2 of the national suffrage organizations, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, with Susan B. Anthony herself saying, "I found the women more awake to the importance of the movement than in any other state." They made a lot of progress. They got almost double the votes they did in 1871, but unfortunately still fell short. So if you see on the map here, this county in yellow, Dawson County in south central Nebraska became a county in 1871, just in time for the first statewide vote on suffrage. And it has this unique distinction in Nebraska history of being the only county in the entire state to vote in favor of suffrage for all 3 elections. Like much of Nebraska, it was heavily settled by homesteaders. There are a total of about 2,000 patents on the General Land Office records, that website we just went through together, and more than 1,300 of those 2,000 patents are homestead entries. The earliest started arriving in the late 1860s, and the first to prove up, remember I mentioned that 5-year period, so the first to make it 5 years was John Wilson in 1873. So at that first 1871 vote, the population in Dawson is pretty tiny. It's only 103 people, and there were only 4 ballots cast, all in favor of women's suffrage. But in a pattern you see across the state, homesteaders swarm in increasing numbers in the late 1800s. Dawson explodes from 103 people in 1870 to more than 12,000 in 1900. In that same period, there are about 1,300 homesteads that are proved up, and using population estimates from the time of about 4.75 per house, that gives us a little more than 6,000 people, so more than half the county potentially as homesteaders. In fact, the number is probably even higher. Children in Nebraska homesteads were a boon. They eased the loneliness that people felt. And of course, they provided invaluable labor for the never-ending farm work. The average Nebraska farm family at that point was more than 5.5 per home. So with that number, we get actually more than 7,000. So Dawson County is an exceptional example in that it voted yes on all 3 attempts, but it does represent some of the broader trends of homesteading and answering the call of women's suffrage. So looking again at this map, we see in the eastern third of the state, it's mostly gray, so that never voted in favor section. We have 7 counties in the red here that voted in 1914 and 1882. I think perhaps the most significant, though, are the ones in the light blue. So these are the ones that voted yes in 1914. That was the only election they actually voted in. They were basically brand new counties. Most of the state west of Polk County here starts really getting settled in the 1870s and on. So the eastern third of the state here was heavily settled early on, and only in Lancaster, the capital of Nebraska, Lincoln, located right here, only in Lancaster did an eastern county actually vote in favor of suffrage in that 1914 election. So the first vote comes too early to have homesteaders. And the second vote, you're still really seeing that rush coming in. But after 1882, county after county after county in the West starts getting populated and created. All these counties in the blue here are divided and created after that vote. And of the 93 counties in the state, 39 of them were created after that election. And of those 39, 32 or 82% vote in favor of women's suffrage. So for at least this portion of the state and throughout states with similar homesteading numbers, I think it's pretty clear that homesteaders, as they're settling, are bringing with them an increased willingness to vote for women's suffrage, in no small part because of the importance and influence of women homesteaders on those family farms. So after urban-based suffrage organizations like the ones organized in Omaha and Lincoln suffered those repeated defeats in elections all the way up to 1914, the movement tries a different approach. It reaches out to those rural Nebraskan women, those homesteading women. Suffragists start writing articles and publications, they organize grassroots campaigns, and they specifically target homesteading women or the wives of male homesteaders. And even though record numbers of urban women had joined the cause, they hadn't really fully reached out to their, quote, more numerous and widely scattered sisters across Nebraska. Now, these sisters, of course, were the homesteaders, the wives of farmers, and the hundreds of thousands whose voices and votes would be needed to effect change. The Suffrage Messenger, which is a Nebraska suffrage paper, played a significant role in the last few years of the movement here and recognized how important these women were. The editor, Mrs. Harrison, said, "You can afford to remember the friend on the homestead and help her to keep up on suffrage news and gather her and her neighbors into a suffrage club." She said that women who own property are in accord with the well-known American principle, taxation without representation is tyranny. So this campaign sought to bring in the whole state, including like never before these rural and isolated areas of the state, especially these remote homesteads. You see here an advertisement from the Suffrage Messenger in 1918 calling for pigs for suffrage. It says that the Nebraska pig is a notoriously kind old fellow. He sends hundreds of boys and girls to school, he builds schools and churches, good roads and telephone lines, and is largely responsible for Nebraska's wealth and prosperity. What is more appropriate than that he should be called upon to give his aid in leading Nebraska into an equal suffrage victory in 1918? So finally, the suffragists here in Nebraska are looking to the friend on the homestead to ally with their economic and their political clout in the state. And the campaign was organized by Harriet King of Benson, Nebraska, whose family had deep homesteading and farming roots. So she was no stranger to the importance of agriculture in Nebraska and sought to connect that urban and rural population. So this pig plan allowed homesteaders and farmers who may not have been able to donate much money to the cause could contribute financially by donating a pig instead. An anonymous woman wrote an article in the Suffrage Messenger saying that the woman farm owner is considered a citizen only when the taxes fall due, but on election day she may not say how those taxes are spent, which is a sentiment echoed by the ever-growing number of women proving up homesteads in their own name, but finding themselves without a legal voice. So Nebraska, like I mentioned earlier, was the most heavily homesteaded state, but it wasn't just Nebraska where the links between homesteading and suffrage were forged. Pictured here we see Jeanette Rankin of Montana. Jeanette Rankin was the daughter of Canadian immigrants who homesteaded in Montana in the 1880s. She grew up on the family ranch, where, like any child of homesteaders, she had to participate in the farm and the household chores that required everyone to pitch in. And her experiences with that led her to reflect that though women and men worked on proving up homesteads side by side as equal, it was very difficult, arduous work, they didn't have equal access to the vote. So she became active in the suffrage movement in college and was actually elected at the age of 36 to the House of Representatives. She was the first federally elected woman in the United States. So as a homesteader woman who made it to Congress, she really represents the successes that the suffrage movement was making in the West and the Midwest after 1900. In 1914, women's suffrage passed in Montana, and it really gained its largest support from some of the new homestead counties in the eastern part of the state. Montana actually had a particularly high number of women homesteaders, as the settlement of Montana coincides with more and more and more women choosing to homestead in the early 1900s. Rankin herself actually recommended homesteading to women as a method of financial and social independence. To one woman who wrote her a letter, if you had a homestead, you could make a living raising chickens. So Rankin, who was a suffragist and arguably the most powerful woman in America at that time, clearly understood the link between being a landowner and having political and personal rights. So you may have noticed that when we looked at the maps of homesteading and suffrage states earlier, there is that one homesteading state west of the Missouri River which didn't pass women's suffrage prior to the 19th Amendment. So that was New Mexico. And that's not to say that there wasn't an active suffrage movement there, just that the social, cultural, and political situation in New Mexico at the turn of the 20th century was a little different from a lot of the rest of the U.S. So following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the cession of what would become the American Southwest from Mexico to the United States in 1848, the majority of the population of those new territories accepted American citizenship, but the cultural and ethnic differences between indigenous, Hispanic, and Anglo-Americans in early New Mexico led to delays in statehood and actually multiple proposals between 1902 and 1910 failing. So there was a lot of effort with that progressive era spirit of reform just towards gaining statehood, but there was still a strong local suffrage movement with both local grassroots and also national elements. There's a Mrs. Betichek who demonstrated how deeply those grassroots efforts had spread when she responded to an essay contest in a women's magazine in 1913, writing, "I'm a plain country woman, a school teacher, now a wife and mother and homesteader in a pleasant little valley in New Mexico. I never in my life was a member of a woman's club, nor am I well known as a suffragette or in any other way. I'm a plain woman, but I want to vote." So this was Lillian Greer Betichek, wife of Roy Betichek. They were second-generation homesteaders. Roy's parents, James and Lucretia, homesteaded in Luna County, New Mexico, as did Roy and Lillian. In fact, Lucretia was one of the approximately 10% of women homesteaders. The final patent was issued in her name in 1917 when she proved up after the death of her husband left her the head of her household. So pictured here on this slide, we see Latina suffragist Adelina Nina Otero Warren, who also homesteaded in New Mexico. And Otero Warren spent her life negotiating between these Hispano, Anglo, and American Indian worlds. She was born to a wealthy Hispano family in New Mexico in 1881, and her father was shot and killed by an Anglo squatter who moved onto her family's land when she was just a young girl. Her family ended up moving into Santa Fe, where she met and married an officer in the U.S. Cavalry, but the marriage didn't last. She got a divorce after only 2 years and began describing herself as a widow. After that, she became active in politics and in the suffrage movement, catching the attention of Alice Paul, who had just founded the National Women's Party, this national women's suffrage organization in the 1910s. So Paul and other suffragists knew the importance of Hispanos in trying to win suffrage in New Mexico, and felt that Nina made this ideal leader. So she was picked to lead the New Mexico chapter of the Congressional Union. And she insisted that all suffrage material be published in both English and in Spanish, and in 1921 actually campaigned for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, becoming the first Latina to run for Congress. She was unfortunately defeated, falling short by a little less than 10,000 votes. In the early 1930s, she and her longtime friend and business partner Mamie Meadows homesteaded and established a ranch under the Stock-Raising Homestead Act of 1916, a few miles out of Santa Fe. They both claimed just short of a full section of land for their homestead and proved up in 1935. And the two ranches which bordered each other were affectionately named Las Dos, or the Two Women. So on May 21st, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the language that would become the 19th Amendment. On June 4th, the Senate followed suit, and the amendment goes to the states, and what we're calling here at the National Park Service the race to ratification began. So a constitutional amendment requires a three-quarters majority. In 1919, that would mean 36 states had to ratify it to become law. So immediately, these pro- and anti-suffrage forces are preparing campaigns, trying to win over states to their cause. One of the national organizations at the time, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, set their rallying cry as a vote for every woman in 1920. And just a week after that, on June 10th, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois actually become the first states to ratify that amendment. By the end of the month, Kansas, Ohio, and New York had joined them. So 5 of the first 6 states to ratify the amendment were actually homesteading states. And throughout the rest of the year, states began to stream in. 22 of the required 36 had ratified, and most of them, 16, were still homesteading states. So by the spring of 1920, it was harvest season for the seeds of suffrage, which had long since been planted in the soil. On March 23rd, 1920, the Gaffney Ledger reported that 9 states remain from which suffrage must harvest a single vote. So after the ratification by Washington in March 1920, 35 had voted to ratify, and only 1 more was needed for that three-quarters majority. Of those 35, every single homesteading state west of the Missouri River had already ratified, including New Mexico, and only several of those states under the Southern Homestead Act had failed to do so. So Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And the picture you see here, I mentioned Alice Paul, so the leader of the National Women's Party, sewing the ratification flags. Each of these stars represent one more state. So they'd sew on a star for each state in that race to ratification to the 19th Amendment. So we see here a map for the ratification of that amendment. The states in green are those states that ratified it prior to August 18th, 1920, so the actual date of ratification, and the states in red after the amendment. So that hunt for the last state began in March, and Mississippi actually came really close. The vote there ended in a tie in the Senate, with the lieutenant governor voting in favor of suffrage, but the House of Representatives voted it down. Mississippi didn't actually officially ratify the amendment until 1984, the last state in the country to do so. But suffrage leaders were optimistic for their chances in Delaware in June, confident that their victory would come there, as most of the remaining states left to vote were hostile to the movement. But Delaware delivered a tough defeat when it went against the 19th Amendment. So at this point, we have 36 states that voted yes, 8 that have voted no, and 3 that refused to bring a special legislative session to consider voting. So that meant that 2 states were left, Tennessee and North Carolina, leaving them the last hope in the summer of 1920. So Nashville, the state capital of Tennessee, becomes this battleground for pro- and anti-suffrage forces, and the state Senate actually passes it pretty quickly, but it stalled in the House at a 48-48 tie. There's a 24-year-old Congressman, Harry T. Byrne, who had sided with the anti-suffragists and had a letter from his mother with him at the session on August 18th, 1920, which said, "Dear son, hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I've been watching to see how you stood, but have not seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help. Lots of love, Mama." Burns said, "I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow." He voted in favor of suffrage and broke the tie. His vote pushed the 19th Amendment across the finish line on August 18, 1920. Tennessee was the 36th and final state required to ratify. It was signed into law on August 26th as the 19th Amendment, stating that, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." So every single homesteading state west of the Missouri River ratified that law. Only the Southern Homestead Act states failed to do so. So for comparison, 25 of 30 homestead states ratified the amendment, compared to about half, 11 of 20 non-homestead states, as we saw in that slide with the states in the green and red. But I think it's important to remember that for many women in America, the 19th Amendment in 1920 isn't actually the end of the story. So the 19th Amendment states that the right of citizens to vote could not be denied on account of gender, but first off, that only applies to citizens, meaning that it didn't apply to Native American women who were not guaranteed citizenship until 1924, or to Asian American women who were not considered to be citizens until the 1940s. And additionally, although black women were citizens, in many parts of the country, voter suppression tactics such as poll taxes and literacy tests prevent their ability to vote. So the story of suffrage doesn't end in 1920 for all women. That being said, the ranks of landowning women homesteaders across the Midwest and Western states swelled between 1862 and 1920, especially in the early 20th century. So as more and more of these women are joining the ranks of propertied Americans, they increasingly sought the rights that had been associated with being a land-owning citizenry. They sought the vote. So homesteaders numbered approximately 1.6 million successful homesteaders. About half of all people who claim land under the Homestead Act made it the 5 years and received their patent. And women homesteaders were a little more than 10% of that number. So that meant that somewhere around 160,000, maybe even up to 200,000 women were joining this historically enfranchised class and using their newfound economic power to push for their equality in the eyes of the law. And when accounting for the numbers of women who were the wives, the daughters, the family members of homesteaders, or single women homesteaders who didn't successfully prove up and earn their patent, then that number swells even higher. And it's no coincidence that as these Midwest and Western homesteading states were exploding in population, they're also granting women the vote, something that, as we saw, a few Eastern states had done. So, of course, the only non-homestead states that did that were New York with full voting rights, and then Rhode Island, Maine, and Tennessee with presidential. By contrast, 24 of 30 homestead states and every single Midwestern state granted women's suffrage prior to the 19th Amendment. So in 1920, 72 years after Seneca Falls, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and women were guaranteed the right to vote across the United States. And I argue that it was homesteaders, women homesteaders in the Homestead Act of 1862 that led the way. I want to thank you all for letting me come and talk to you today. If you have any questions at all about the Homestead Act, about Homestead National Monument, about genealogy and some of the tools I shared with you today, about women's suffrage, anything at all, I'd be happy to field them.
Okay, I'm going to invite the class to go ahead and type in to the chat box any questions they might have. And in the meantime, Jonathan, I have a couple questions. I kind of wrote down a few of them during the presentation. I guess the first question that might be on everyone's mind, during the COVID-19 shutdown, is your park open?
We are open. So the park itself has been open this entire time. The visitor center, so that the buildings here at the park were closed from March 22nd through June 1st. But we are open again, very excited to be open and able to provide these programs and provide access to the park to the American public. So definitely glad to be here.
Wonderful. Okay. I hope everyone in my class, if you happen to be driving through that state, if you would stop and support the park, that would be great. Now, I have a question also. You mentioned that during the 5 years that after they applied for the land, that there were certain requirements like farming that they had to succeed with in order to continue to own the land. Did that include, I mean, when I think of farming, I think of crops, but did it also include ranching?
Yes, it absolutely did. So you just had to improve the land in some way, which was understood to be either cultivating crops or raising livestock. In fact, I mentioned briefly in my slide on Adelina Otero Warren that she had a ranch under the Homestead Act. The stock raising Homestead Act specifically, actually, you had to ranch. So you could claim 160 acres under the original Homestead Act, but there were a few laws later on, parts of the country that weren't quite as good for farming, for growing crops, but were pretty good for ranching. And so in those parts of the country, you could gain actually up to 640 acres, so 4 times the size of a normal homestead for livestock.
Yeah, that's kind of what caught my when we were talking earlier about Nevada, because certainly you see a lot more ranching in Nevada than you do, growing of crops. So that was something that caught my attention. Also, I wanted to let the students know because unfortunately, unlike California, most public libraries in California allow a free access to a subscription to Ancestry.com. But I wanted to let everyone in my class know that there are other places here in Nevada that you can get free access to Ancestry.com if you don't want to pay for one at home. And that would be the local LDS library. And there, of course, there's one in Reno, and there's also one in Carson City. And also at the state library here in Carson City, they also offer free access to Ancestry.com. Now, one of the questions my students had, let's see here, I'm looking at the chat box now. A lot of people are saying, what a great presentation. They're all just coming in saying, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. But one, Tracy would like to know, do you have data on what percentage of homestead applicants were women?
Yeah, so the best guess is about 10%. That number does increase after about 1900, and in some parts of the country, in some counties or townships, it's as high as almost 20%. So is there a certain area or time period? And I do research requests, so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to field them. I'll go ahead and say my email address, but I'm sure that Suzanne can provide it as well. But if you have a specific question that you want answered in a little more detail, you can send me a message at Jonathan, JONATHAN _ Fairchild, FAIRCHILD, at nps.gov.
Wonderful. And then Beth would like to know, why was the Homestead Act ended? Why was it repealed? Why did it end?
Yeah, so the Homestead Act lasted until 1976 in the lower 48, and it actually got a 10-year extension in Alaska until 1986. So there are a couple of different reasons. One was that there were some changing land laws in how you could claim and receive land. But also the number of homestead claims that had been going on from realistically the late 1940s through the 1970s really starts declining. The peak actually is later than a lot of people think. The peak of homesteading is about 1910 to 1919, but by the 1940s, a lot of the available lands, public lands, are fairly marginal, difficult to homestead on. So as that number keeps dropping and they're changing land laws and less demand, it is eventually repealed. So the very last homestead was in Alaska in the 1980s.
Wow, that's wonderful. That's great information. And then Nancy would like to know, what was the process of getting ownership of land for settlers prior to the Homestead Act?
Yeah, so there are actually several different land laws. I talked a little bit about the Public Land Survey System and the Land Ordinance of 1785. That's basically what establishes, for the first time, acquiring public lands. So the initial way was to just purchase it directly. You'd go to the land office and pay for your 640 acres. In 1820, that law is changed, reformed a little. Instead of having to buy a full section at a time, you can now purchase 160-acre parcels. And there are also land grants for military service where you just received a parcel. You didn't pay it, but you received it as a reward for your service with the U.S. military. And that goes all the way up until the Civil War. So you'll see if you use that general land office record tool I showed you, you'll often see that as distributing land, especially in Kansas. You'll see some in Nebraska, a lot of the Midwest in the 1850s.
Okay, and Connie would like to know, what is the legal aspect of homesteading that people do nowadays?
The legal, so the term that you'll hear now, homesteading?
Correct.
So that, as far as my understanding, is more of a way of life rather than what we talk about here at the monument. So it's not claiming 160 acres of public lands from the federal government to settle on and start a farm, but more of a lifestyle.
Yeah, I think when you own a home and you file a homestead on your land, I think that there's some legal protections involved as well. But that's perhaps a question for another time. I had a question. You mentioned that they had to stay on the land 5 years and meet certain requirements in the event of a no cash sale situation. What happened if they failed to fulfill the requirements that they were required to do in that 5 years?
So if you didn't meet the requirements, there were a couple of processes. You could appeal for perhaps an extension if you had extenuating circumstances. Perhaps there was a blizzard or drought, things beyond your control. You could also, if you didn't purchase it, commute it like I talked about earlier, then if you didn't appeal, if you didn't commute, then unfortunately the land wasn't legally yours, so you'd have to forfeit it.
I see, and that would all be in the file, I would assume.
Yes and no. So the files that are on Ancestry are specifically the files for successfully proved up, for completed claims. Now there are still, they're referred to as relinquished or canceled homestead claims. So those are the ones that didn't end up being issued a patent, and there are quite a few of them. Like I said, about 50% of homesteads were successfully proven up, so that means about 50% weren't. Those are not as easily available online. I believe that Family Search has quite a few of the ones from Nebraska and Kansas, but to find other states, you'd have to go either to a state archive or a federal archive in a certain state or for a certain area to pull those up.
So you cannot go on the assumption that the states that are listed in Ancestry.com with those files necessarily are inclusive, because they are not, correct?
Yeah, so on Ancestry, for one, they don't have the whole period of homesteading. They go from 1863, so the first year, they have the beginning up till 1908. They have, about the first half of the homesteading period. But from 1909 through the end of homesteading, whether it's 76 in the lower 48 or 86 in Alaska, those aren't digitized for any state except for Nebraska. Nebraska does have all of them. Otherwise, you'd need to contact the National Archives to get a case file for everything past that. Although that being said, that website I showed you with the map, so the General Land Office records, that does have everything. So you can at least access the map, you can access the index, you can access the patent image. You just can't always access online the land entry case files, the page by page by page of documentation.
Understood. Okay, that's really great to know. Now, I imagine probably some of my students were wondering, what is the definition of a meridian and an aliquot?
Yeah, so a meridian, and let me pull back up the map if you don't mind. You can still see the slides there, right?
Yes, uh-huh.
Yes. One second here. Okay, so this map right here, you see here principal, meridians, and baselines. So you'll see that there are different colors on this map, and these reflect the meridians and baselines. So a baseline is a parallel of latitude, which is established from a certain designated survey point upon which all rectangular surveys are based. And then a principal meridian is a true meridian. So those two come together to form the highest level framework for a PLSS survey. So when you see that meridian on there, it's measuring from a certain location, like measuring here in Nebraska from a meridian and baseline here. So if it says, it's 10 north and 10 east from a meridian and baseline, it's measuring, 10 measurements north and 10 measurements east from that. And each one of these is measured from a different set of meridians and baselines.
Oh, that's really interesting. Wow.
So I talked about the county and the township and the section. So those are like the smaller level. So big picture, meridian, baseline, smaller level, township, and then section and range. And then you asked about aliquot. So can you see my cursor over here?
Yes, we can see it.
So this is a section. So an aliquot measures the specific parcel of a section. It's the actual piece of land reference. So for example, if you see northeast quarter under aliquot, it's referring to that. And it's not necessarily a quarter section or even a half a quarter section. You could see the aliquot as saying, for example, the southeast quarter of the northeast quarter. So that would mean the southeast quarter of the larger northeast quarter. So that could be an aliquot. This could be an aliquot. That could be an aliquot. So it's just the smallest. So if it goes big picture, meridian, baseline, and then township, and then section, and then aliquot.
That's a great explanation. Wow. Okay, we're getting some more questions from the class. Sarah would like to know, what is the connection between the Homestead Act, land grants, and land grant universities?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. So if you remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I talked about how busy the Lincoln administration was in the middle of the Civil War, right? So several laws being signed into law, taking effect in 1862, 1863. So the Homestead Act was one of them, but the Morrill Land Grant Act, which is what established these land grant universities. So similar with distributions of lands, the government gave lands to state universities to sell to fund the universities. So you'll also see that patent on the General Land Office records as well.
Wow, okay, that's wonderful. Gosh, the class has a lot of questions. Jean would like to know, when will Nebraska have their records digitized?
Nebraska?
That's what she asked.
So Nebraska is fully digitized. It's done. From the very beginning to the very end, all Nebraska homestead records are available online. And that brings me to one other resource I didn't mention. If you're familiar with Fold 3, which normally is military records, they also have Nebraska's homesteading records, but specifically just Nebraska.
Okay, I have Fold 3 and I didn't even know that, so that's wonderful to know. Now, you went over some great examples of where to find the files for the homesteads, but where would you recommend, since a big chunk of your presentation was about women's right to vote, where would you find the women's names on the voting records? The vote, like the list of people who were registered to vote. Where would you suggest people look for those?
That is an excellent question, and it made a little more difficult, especially with the situation going on right now, because that's not necessarily something that would be kept at a federal level. You would have to go either state or county or local, so archives that are state or county local level. You can also find, and one of the sources I've been using in my research is states will have, it's not necessarily a roster per se, but we'll have like a Secretary of State, Secretary of State for Nebraska, for Nevada, record books year by year by year. And I've been using that to figure out, like I showed you the maps of elections by county, so you can figure out that at any rate. And a lot of those are available online with the Hathi Trust digital libraries.
Wonderful. Yeah, my class should be aware of that. We've talked about that resource before. And you got me thinking as well. I think I'm going to contact our state library here in Carson City because they're also the state archives as well. And I'm going to inquire if they have the voting rolls because they probably do, I would think. Because I'm very interested in Nevada history myself, so that's definitely something I'm going to follow up on. And thank you for giving that seed of thought planted today, because I had not thought about that before. Let's see here now. Using Nebraska as the example, when there are high numbers of women homesteaders, let's see. Hold on, I'm reading my handwriting here, which was terrible handwriting as I was jotting it down during your presentation. Okay. Using Nebraska as the example. Were there high numbers of women homesteaders in other states? In other words, like, did Nebraska have like a higher incident of women homesteaders than other states did?
So I'm glad you asked that. Nebraska actually had a lower number of women homesteaders in the sense of making claims in their own names, proving up in their own names. It's actually a little bit lower than the national average. So here in Nebraska, we have a lot of homesteading basically in two waves. So the first wave comes right after the Homestead Act in the 1870s and the 1880s. And then out in the western part of the state, if you remember, I showed you the map with all the blue counties. Those light blue, that's what's referred to as the Nebraska Sand Hills. And that starts happening really more 1890s and early 1900s. But both those waves of homesteading come a little before the highest percentage of women homesteaders, which is about 1900 to 1920. And so Nebraska is a little lower than elsewhere in the state. You see a lot more, especially in Montana, you'll see a bunch. In Wyoming, you'll see a bunch. And I'm actually working on a resource study. Like I said, this presentation is based off of. But what I did with that map for Nebraska and the in-depth look into Nebraska, I've actually done that on a bunch of different states and mapped it out to really understand how all of the American homesteading experience is tied to suffrage. I've been looking at Michigan, I've been looking at California, so you see it throughout the country. That'd just be a much longer presentation.
You sparked my interest earlier also on another thing that you mentioned. You mentioned that there were, X amount of descendants of female homesteaders. I know, like, for instance, the Mayflower descendants, they have a database to trace all of the descendants of the Mayflower. They've joined up with Family Search and American Ancestors to create such a database. The Union Daughters of the Civil War has a database, tracing the daughters of the Union veterans of the Civil War. Is there such a project going on to trace the descendants of the female homesteaders?
If there is, I'm not aware of it, and I certainly wished there was. We do have a project here at the monument, a couple of projects actually. One is on an oral history program with living descendants of all homesteaders, and in fact, some homesteaders themselves, especially out in Alaska, there are still some living homesteaders. Idaho had some well into the 50s, 60s that are still around, part of that program. But we also have here a family history collection. We invite people that are tied to the homesteading story to submit copies of any genealogical research they've done or anything they want to share with us. So we've got that collection as well. It's not specifically women homesteaders, but there is certainly some of that in the collection.
So if my class, and I know there's actually, including myself, quite a few people in my class that can easily trace their ancestor to a homestead claim, how would they get that information to you? Would it be a GEDCOM file? Would it be maybe a book that they've written? Would it be essays they've written? I mean, how would they share that information with you?
Yeah, we're happy to accept any sort of format. We've certainly got booklets and books that people have produced. We've got even PDF or Word documents sent in digitally. We've got some oral histories with people, audio recordings sharing their stories. We're not picky. Anything that people are willing to share, we're happy to take and preserve and share the grand story of American homesteading.
Wow, that's wonderful. Okay, well, I hope that inspires every one in my class to get those records to you and so you can preserve them. That's wonderful. Now, we have another question, actually two more questions. Nancy would like to know, could a married woman homestead land as well as her husband?
So that answer is actually fairly complicated, and it changes over time. The General Land Office at some points did allow it, but generally speaking didn't. There were a few times where if a single woman filed a claim and was proving up her claim, lived on her claim, and got married, there were times when the woman could finish her homestead and receive it, but it's a fairly small period of time in the 120 period of homesteading.
Okay. So, of course, if a woman homesteader married, after the 5 years of successful requirements being met, it was hers to do whatever she wanted to, right? I mean, she could marry, not marry, whatever the case may be.
Yes and no. So you had a limit on how much land your household could claim under the Homestead Act, and that limit does grow over time. I mentioned some of the other laws as you expand to like the full section, the 640 acres for ranching land. So you could also say in 1895, you're a single woman, you claim your homestead, you get 160 acres. And you meet a man who also in 1895 claims 160 acres. You get married, you now have 320 acres. In 1895, you can't go beyond that amount of land. But here in Nebraska in 1904, there's what's called the Kincaid Act, which allows 640 acres of homesteading for a certain part of the state. And in 1916, throughout the United States, throughout homesteading areas, you can claim on 640 for ranching. So now you only have 320 of your 640 acres of land. So you can keep that land and even expand. So sort of a complicated answer for a complicated question.
Understood. Well, thank you. Let's see here. Sarah would like to know, why was Beatrice chosen to have the national monument?
Yeah, so we are actually located on Daniel Freeman's homestead claim. He was the very first person in the country to claim land under the Homestead Act of 1862. So we are on the first homestead. Like physically, the monument is the boundaries of Daniel Freeman's land, his 160 acres.
Okay, and Sarah would also like to know, what requirements did land-grant universities have?
In terms of?
Hopefully she'll chime in because I see she's still online. Maybe Sarah, could you expand on that question a little bit more? And while you're doing that, I have a question. You showed that beautiful picture of the ratification flag. Does that flag still exist?
I believe that, yes, it is, I want to say, with the Smithsonian, I think. And we actually got a replica of it here at Homestead as part of the National Park Service's centennial events, and we're sewing on the stars as we do our own race to ratification. So very excited to have that here and celebrate that part of the story.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, Sarah didn't, Sarah, if you're still there, please add to your question a little bit more so we can get that answered for you.
I'll try to take a stab at what I think she's getting at. So land-grant universities, the land that they received wasn't actually, say, for example, I'm Texas, so thinking about land-grant universities there, you didn't necessarily have 20,000 acres granted around the University of Texas as a land grant, or didn't have 20,000 acres right around the University of Nebraska, here in Nebraska. You had grip or like things you could redeem anywhere in the country. You didn't claim land at or near that university. You could go to any land office anywhere in the country and have that piece of paper saying, I have this paper for 160 acres for the Morrill Land Grant Act, and I want to redeem it here or there. But the proceeds from that, the money, went to the university to fund the establishing of the university.
Okay, I believe that might have answered her question because she added to it to get funding or designation.
Yeah, I think that tackles that.
Okay. All right, so I'll give the class a few more moments. There was a lot of good questions today, and I really appreciate the class giving those. Let's see if there's any last-minute questions here, and please type them in because our class is starting to wind down here. So let's see here. No, I don't see any other questions coming in. So I'm going to say thank you so much. I got such really great feedback in the chat box about this presentation. Everyone just said how wonderful it was and how much they learned. So Jonathan, I just can't say thank you enough, and thank you for allowing us to record today's presentation. And we will be posting this on our school YouTube channel. So with that, I'll go ahead and let everyone know if they'd like to hang up. All they have to do is click on that red hang up button. And for anybody who'd like to stay for the last hour of class to work on their family trees one-on-one with me, please stay on the line and everybody else can go ahead and hang up. So thank you very, very much, Jonathan. And if you would like to disconnect your connection, I'll just go on with the class with the one-on-one research that we always do every week.
All right. It was a pleasure. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.